So we're going to start to look at our actual gameplay or run our simulation, and we'll talk about some of the basics of going from the scene view to the game view. Now, the first thing that we want to be mindful of is that inside of our scene we have a main camera. If I click one time on the main camera, not only will I get information in the property inspector, but I'll also get a preview of the camera. Okay, and by default, we have one camera. It's our main camera. When we run our game, we're going to look through this camera. So now the way that we go from our edit mode, our scene editing, authoring mode, to our play mode is by using this play button at the top of the screen. So just above our scene view, when I hit play, you'll notice a couple of different things. One, the play button gets highlighted. The game tab comes forward and gains focus, and now we're looking through our camera. We've adopted the view of our camera. I'm going to toggle the play button and we'll snap back to our scene view. Now we can also manually click on our game tab view to get an idea of what our default camera view is. But our game is not running right now. We're just looking through our camera, and I'll go back to my scene. So I have a couple of different options to preview my game. Now, it's really important when we're creating interactivity and running simulations and making our game that we can enter and exit play mode efficiently. And we can click on the play button. Now, we don't want to pause and we don't want to advance frame. We always just want to play and unplay. So I'll toggle the play button to stop. And the most efficient way to do this is on the Mac, use Command P to play and Command P to toggle that play button in and out. Control P on a PC. And this is the method I'm going to use, and it's the method that I recommend that you use. And there's something, it's important to point out that if you're in play mode and you try to modify an object, for example, I'll go to the ball and I'll change the position of the ball. When I toggle the play button or I leave play mode, you'll notice that it snaps back to its position before we were in play mode. So any changes that we make while we're in play mode, while our simulation is running, will not be retained when we go back to editing. And that's just for testing, to try different combinations while our game is running. So we want to be mindful of that so that we don't inadvertently pause or keep the play button running. We make a bunch of changes and then realize that nothing we've done is saved. So I've made some progress over the last couple of presentations, and so it's not a bad idea right now to choose File Save to save our scene, just to kind of update some of the parameters that we've adjusted inside of our scene view. I'm going to go back to my Assets folder. So I have my Level 1 and I have my Materials. I'm going to select my camera, and because my Move tool is selected, again, I kind of get a better sense of a preview of what the camera is, and I'm getting this cone of vision. I can see it's kind of a white outline. And as I move this camera up, you can see in the preview, it's kind of changing my perspective a bit. So I'm lifting the camera up just a little bit. Maybe I'll drag it back in Z space, and I'll go to the rotation fields in transform, and I'm going to tip this down. I'm going to rotate it along the x-axis. So I'll find the rotation of x, and I'll just use this trick of rolling my mouse over the x label, and I'll drag one way, and you can see negative is making it look up. And if I move into the positive, it kind of makes it start to look down a little bit. So I'm just going to pitch my camera down just a little bit using this camera preview to get a better sense of what I'm looking at. Now, I'm going to move to the ball for a moment, and I'm going to lift that up even higher. In fact, to the point where I'm not even concerned if it even falls out of the camera frame just a little bit, but I want this to be kind of a dramatic introduction to gravity. So I'm going to select the ball, make sure that the ball is selected, and I want to add a rigid body to this object. And what that's going to do is allow this sphere, this ball, to talk to the physics engine that's inside Unity. By default, these game objects are not going to talk to the physics engine, but we can tell individual objects to basically use gravity or talk to the physics engine by selecting the object, going to the components menu, and in this case we're going to go into the physics category, and we're going to choose rigid body. Now when I do, watch what happens in the inspector here. I'll choose physics, not physics 2D, but physics, rigid body. And when I do, I now have a rigid body component that's been added to my sphere. Now, because this has a rigid body component, it's going to talk to the physics engine when our game runs. Now, inside our inspector, every time we see a group of information that's separated by a horizontal rule, this is referred to as a component. And the title, this is a transform component, this is a rigid body component. And this component has information that kind of governs that bit of information. In this case, we can adjust the mass and drag and some other things within this object. And now, if I just hit the play button, or toggle the play button, you can see that that ball falls to the ground. Because it has a rigid body on it, it's being addressed by the physics engine. So I'll toggle the play button one more time. So this object is talking to gravity. In the event that I want to remove this component, I added the wrong component, or I decided that I had the wrong object selected, each one of these components has a little cog, a little settings wheel over here in the far right. And if I click on it, we have a couple of different options. We can reset the component back to its defaults as if we just added it. We can remove the component, and we can copy and move it up and down in this layer stack. In this case, I could remove the component, and now when I toggle the play button or hit Command P, you can see that it's back to the previous state. It does not have a rigid body. And therefore it is not being governed by the physics engine. I'll toggle the play button to turn it off. Go to components, physics, rigid body. I now have a rigid body, and so when I hit the play button, that sphere falls to the ground again. So this sphere is falling because it has this rigid body. We're going to tweak some of these values to get some different results going here, and I'll set up a couple of objects just to kind of guide this sphere and try to run it into this cube here in a moment. But one more note about the property inspector is that these can be a little overwhelming, a lot of information here. And our goal for this first project is really just to kind of focus on some core components, some nuts and bolts of the game interface. We're not spending a lot of time designing our project or doing any kind of pre-production. We're just jumping in and we're playing, and that's really what this project is about. It's about experimentation. We're gonna make sure that we familiarize ourselves with the interface and some of the options that are available, but we're really kind of designing as we go. Now, after this project, we'll take a deeper dive into the design process. However, right now we just want to tune into some of the basic components, and if we come across something like this rigid body component, or really anything inside the Unity interface, particularly in the inspector, if I want to experiment with some of these values, it might feel like I'm not making a whole lot of progress if I modify something and I don't understand how it's affecting my game or my scene. If ever I have any questions about a specific element within this component, I can go over here to where I see this little blue book with a question mark. And if I click on that, anytime I see that book, that will take me to the live documentation for Unity. And this will describe it'll describe the component itself and describe each one of the values of the fields and how that might affect that component. So as we start to experiment with things and we talk about, one or two things within this component, make sure that you explore the documentation and experiment with some of these values. In the event that, we goof something up, we can always just go back to this little settings cog and choose to reset it. So if I inadvertently change my mass to 14 or 15 and set the drag to something and key in some values and click some things around, I'm not sure what I just did and I don't remember what the default settings are, I'll just go back and say reset, and then I'll snap it back to its default. Okay, so one last thing for this presentation, I have my sphere falling to the ground. I'm going to go to Game Object. I'm going to create a new cube. This cube is going to be a platform. So I'm going to name it so, or maybe I can call it ramp. And I'm going to scale it along the x, let's say 4 meters. I'll scale it slightly narrower along the z, or whether it's x or z, it doesn't matter, but I'm going to thin it out, say 0.25 on the y, so 1/4 of a meter. And I'll just position this in space where I think, I'm just kind of eyeballing it, I'm going to look at it from a couple of different angles, just kind of orbit around, and I'm pretty confident that that's underneath my sphere. And I'll rotate this object according to its z, and I'll just kind of make a little ramp out of it. Okay. Now, as I rotate this, and I'm just kind of choosing an arbitrary value, based on visually how this looks, but I'll round this down to maybe, once I get in the neighborhood of where I want to be, I like to round off some of these numbers. And this will be a good opportunity to point out that as I rotated this object, its axes rotated with it, which is a good thing. But now when I move this object up along y, it's actually moving in the y space, and also it's moving in the z space as well, because our axis is no longer moving, pointing up and down. So as I move this, I can see its position change over x and y, and that's okay. But just know that as I rotate these objects around, its axes are no longer in line with the world space. We're referring to the object axes at this point. Okay, so I got this ramp lined up. I'll hit the play button and see what happens. So my sphere falls and rolls and hits this cube, and you can see that it just kind of immediately comes to a stop. In the next presentation, we'll talk about playing with different variables to get these objects to react in different ways. We'll apply different materials that will cause things to be bouncy or slippery, and we'll experiment with some dynamic hinges, and we'll get to the point where we can knock over this simple cube here and maybe set up some dominoes and some other things. But we'll do that in the next presentation. For now, grab your sphere, make sure that you apply some basic materials, and add a rigid body to your sphere, and then just set up a simple ramp solution that kind of sends this sphere falling into a different direction. And we'll catch up in the next presentation and continue to refine our physics. Have fun with it.